Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our panel this afternoon on the future of free college at the College Promise Careers Institute. My name's Martha Cantor, and I'm the CEO of College Promise, a national nonpartisan nonprofit initiative that builds broad public support for Promise scholarships and supports that enable hardworking students, especially the growing number of low-income, first-generation, and students of color, to enter and complete the first 2 or more years of post-secondary education. While the federal proposal to provide 2 years of free community college for Americans was removed from the reconciliation bill, communities and states are continuing to make the college promise happen for our nation's students. This panel will reflect on the benefits of offering paid-for tuition and supports to all hardworking Americans and where we go from here. Now let me introduce our roundtable of experts. This afternoon, we have Tony Carnevale, the Director and Research Professor at Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, Alexandria Walton Radford, Director of the Center for Applied Research in Postsecondary Education at the American Institutes for Research, AIR, and Mitch Stevens, Professor and Director of the Pathways Lab at Stanford University's Graduate School of Education. So let me start with Tony. Tony, tell us about your organization, and then we'll hear from Alexandria and Mitch.
Our policy center at Georgetown University is driven essentially by the growing tension between two sets of facts. The first set of facts is that since the 1980s, really after 1983, post-secondary education and training has become the most well-traveled pathway to economic success for most people. That's good news to me. It speaks to the long revolution and the growing value of human capital, and I think that's a good thing. The second set of facts is more troubling, and that more troubling set of facts tells us that because of its new prominence in American life, economic life, post-secondary education and training has also become the capstone in an education and training pipeline that runs from preschool to labor markets and is a primary cause of the reproduction of race and class privilege across generations. So we know that smart low-income kids don't do as well as smart high-income kids as they move through the education pipeline. And as a rule, it's better to be rich than smart in America. The evidence is plain when we follow student test scores beginning in K-12, a child from a family in the top quartile of family income who has low test scores has more than a 70% chance of graduating from college and getting a good job at a minimum of $65K ultimately. However, a child from a low-income family from the bottom family income quartile with top test scores has only a 31% chance of doing that. So virtually everything we do at Georgetown sort of wanders around among those two sets of facts.
So let's go to Alexandria.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. So I work at the American Institutes for Research. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization. We conduct behavioral and social science research and deliver technical assistance. And we do so to really tackle the most urgent challenges in the US and around the world. Our mission at AIR is to generate and use rigorous evidence that contributes to a better and more equitable world. I personally direct our Center for Applied Research in Post-Secondary Education. Our center is committed to improving post-secondary education for today's students, the real today's students, by generating rigorous evidence and helping those in the field connect research and practice. I'm pleased to be speaking here, particularly about our recent work on free college programs for adults.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and let's go to Mitch Stevens to introduce himself from the West.
Hello, Martha. Thanks for having me. Delighted to be here. I'm a sociologist in the Graduate School of Education and devoting most of my time to two projects. One is the Pathways Lab, which attempts to think sequentially and apply a life course perspective to post-secondary learning opportunities so that we can understand how learning and education unfold step by step over the course of increasingly long lives. And the other is I've been working with colleagues nationally to assemble a framework for an applied science that would support improvement of services to working learners, recognizing that virtually all of what social scientists know about educational processes and returns is organized around instruction that people experience in the first 22 years of their lives. And we haven't invested nearly the same amount of resource and intellect to understanding how learning and educational progress unfold throughout adulthood.
And especially through the working lives of the students that are in school now or plan to be.
Yes,
Well,
indeed.
thanks again for everything, for the introductions and for joining us this afternoon. So we have a bunch of questions that are going to be challenging, and I'll kick off the conversation by asking each of you, starting with Tony, to reflect on the economic benefits that a national federal-state partnership could yield. Why do you think this is not a top economic issue, especially in the free college movement?
I think the short answer is, to cut through a long conversation, is the numbers don't vote, although they do make a persuasive political and economic case for themselves. So we know pretty clearly that there's great value in education and increasingly in post-secondary education. Our latest rough estimates in response to the free community college debate are that about if we'd have gotten that, and if all 50 states had participated, which is a big if, there would have been a boost to GDP of about $170 billion over 10 years, far above the cost. If we'd added public four-year colleges, which is, remember, where Biden started out, the benefits would have doubled approximately, depending on the offsets from declines in private college enrollments, which we believe would have occurred, so that the overall numbers wouldn't have grown double, but nearly double, and the benefits would have been nearly double. You're talking about $370 billion in GDP over the long haul. So in almost all these, in every case, the benefits of free college is worth the cost. We found a couple numbers from the Gates Value Commission that we provided for them. If you raise the educational attainment of lower income adults to equal the attainment distribution of the middle and higher income adults, that would result in about $950 billion and some change, about another $8 billion actually, I think, in increased economic value. That would have had included $540 billion in GDP, about $300 billion and some change in higher federal, state, and local tax revenue, about $14 billion in reduced criminal justice expenditures, almost $60 billion in reduced public health expenditures, and almost $35 billion in reduced expenditures for public assistance programs. And if these increases in educational attainment could be achieved without adding any debt for lower income students, the public benefits would have gone up by another $200 billion. So why won't free college pass Congress anytime soon? I think, the obvious answer is they got forced to choose in the end. Free college, four-year college went out the window quickly. I think that's understandable. They moved to two-year free college, which is the sweet spot in the political debate, I think. And then they came to a choice between free two-year college and early childhood interventions. I agree with the forced choice they had to make, dollar for dollar. Investments in early childhood have stronger cumulative effects in terms of long-term effects on people's opportunity. It's a natural choice in the data. So in the end, I have only two. I'm all for free college, but I'm not for free college if it doesn't come with complete transparency for all degrees at the program level. By that, I mean transparency on employment and earnings. I also think any version of free college needs to come with a mandated career counseling mechanism to deliver information to students, parents, funders. And I think I think a lot of us see now, we're moving from degrees to training as the center of support in congressional deliberations and in the states. And I think in that case, we also need a value-added gainful employment rule for likely expansion in Title IV programs for training. I think free college has a solid future. Anybody, especially any Democrat, knows that since Jimmy Carter's Middle Income Student Assistance Act, aid for colleges moves votes. K-12 doesn't. I think the political sweet spot nowadays is free community college, along with increased public money for training. I think that's where we're headed, either in the states or nationally. So, when I work with politicians, I coach them to say, what I coach them to say or tell them they'll get away with is if they are standing in front of an audience of Americans, the first thing they need to say on this issue is, folks, I think we can agree that everybody doesn't need a 4-year degree or a graduate degree. And most of the audience will give you nodding agreement. Many of the people who nod will be thinking, my children need a 4-year degree, but other people's children don't. But then you say in the second half, maybe in a pleading tone, but folks, come on, can't we all agree that just about everybody needs more than a high school degree to make it nowadays? And I think you'll get grudging majority support. So I think what we're headed for is 14 is the new 12. I think we're going to get 2 years of free college ultimately, either through the states or it's going to come nationally at some point, maybe several years from now. I think the other good thing about free community colleges is it adds 2 more years to K-12, and that takes the tracking issue off the table, at least to some extent. Something we've tried to do since Rodriguez v. San Antonio in 1973 and since a Nation at Risk in 1983.
Well, thanks. Let me turn to Alexandria and just get a different perspective to think about the economic benefits if we were able to have a federal-state partnership. Why isn't this a top economic issue in the country?
It's a great question, and Tony did a great job laying that out. I think I would offer 2 points. I mean, Tony is right about the economic benefits to free college, and I agree that federal and state collaborations would really help advance and scale free college. But I just want to, tell our audience, hope is not lost. It's important to recognize that there are other ways to fund and expand free college programs. As Tony points out, there are politically diverse states that have enacted programs. In addition, in our recent review of free college tuition programs for adults, we found multiple examples of philanthropy and private donors funding programs, as well as employers not just serving as partners in these programs, but helping fund them as well. Ivy Tech's Achieve Your Degree program comes to mind in particular, where they've leveraged employer-paid tuition funds from 200 plus employers, I want to say, to support that free college attendance. So I encourage folks, in light of the recent reconciliation bill and the direction that's taken, to continue to think creatively about how to fund free college programs to provide those opportunities, because you're right, the benefits are there and people are supportive. So we need to roll up our sleeves and think about ways that we can fund these programs. The second thing I want to just point out and stress is that, this may seem obvious, but to maximize the benefits of free college programs, we need to ensure that they're set up so that more students actually enroll and that they actually complete. So as stakeholders are coming together to create new programs or expand existing programs, I really want to emphasize that they think about a couple of things. So first, that's the enrollment piece. We know it's not just recent high school graduates who need post-secondary credentials. U.S. adults do too. In fact, we're not going to meet our post-secondary attainment goals as a nation just by increasing recent high school graduates' completion of post-secondary education. And so it was disheartening to us of being optimistic on the one hand, but a little down on this side, in that when we did our study, we reviewed several hundreds of free college and promise programs, and the vast majority were really restricted to recent high school graduates. We only found 67 that were even just technically open to adults. And when we looked at programs that were more actually friendly to adults and their needs, there were even fewer. So for example, we know that 20% of US adults have some college but no degree. But we only found 30 programs that would allow individuals who fall into that category of having some post-secondary education but not yet a credential to participate in that free college program. We also know that adults typically attend part-time. About 63% of post-secondary students who are financially independent, which we use sometimes as a proxy for adult students, attend part-time. But we only found 18 adult-eligible free college programs that allowed students to attend part-time. So we really need to ensure that free college programs are set up in a way that allow adults to enroll if we want to maximize the benefits of free college programs. And then the second piece of that, again, is to maximize that benefit, we need to make sure they don't just enroll, but they have the supports needed to complete credentials. So free tuition helps. It's huge. It's a great big thing that we're doing, but we need to recognize that there are other costs, books, transportation, childcare. Some free college programs are covering those, but others aren't. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that there are non-financial supports that we know make a real difference in students being able to turn that free college tuition into a credential. So some free college programs have counseling, advising, and mentoring embedded into their programs, sometimes even as a requirement, but others don't. So we can't think that the work stops at providing free tuition if we really want to realize that full benefit of free tuition programs.
Thanks, Alexandria. And Mitch, why don't you take this question from the perspective of what you're doing now?
Sure.
Is this a top economic issue?
Sure. Well, Tony said that numbers don't vote. Another way of saying that is that social scientists rarely change hearts and minds. A few other things to echo. Free college, absolutely. But boy, we don't have a very well instrumented higher education system. I often say that I can more reliably purchase a used car in the state of California, a used car that I have not seen, and trust what I'm buying, than to enter a credential marketplace in the state of California. It is an embarrassment, I think, that the post-secondary establishment has in fact actively prevented the kinds of transparency that Tony is calling for. And that transparency has caused a lot of disillusionment for millions of people and a lot of indebtedness. And I think those of us who care deeply about higher education and know its overall value, I think too quickly forget just how disillusioned and many of our fellow Americans have become by a higher education system that is very poorly instrumented for me to know as a learner consumer what path I'm on, how long that path is going to take, where it will lead me, and at what cost. And so I agree with Tony that anything we do forward can't just be adding resources to an organizational infrastructure that we already have. And I strongly encourage all of us who are working in this field to think about ways in which new forms of funding could encourage the kinds of organizational change that we need to see to make college more reliably a vehicle of upward mobility. And I don't think that simply making the cost of the out-of-pocket cost of college to Americans is by itself going to change that dilemma. And so I think, in a sense, the current politics has given us a reprieve as activists and organizers and policymakers to sort of think about what kinds of federal incentives funding could be organized to incent the kind of change that we want to see in terms of transparency and reliability of outcomes. And then, per Alexandria's point, what kinds of organizational forms and programs could we build specifically for people at a later stage in their lives. Again, I think I agree with Tony. I think we're going to see an extension of the social contract further into college. But I don't think that we have been as imaginative and frankly as critical as we might be in terms of thinking about how that investment could be made to not only provide more education, but better and more reliable and frankly more humane higher education than we currently have.
Yeah, I think there's concurrence on the need for more transparency and as much imagination as we can put to bear on these questions of, enrollment and access and success in the programs and the relationship to work.
And I'll say one more thing about that, Martha. What I mean is, I do think that the nation's colleges and universities will respond creatively if they are encouraged to respond creatively, right? If they are rewarded, for moving the furniture around, and that's where I think fresh conversations about the how of post-secondary provision is something that this group, I think, is ideally positioned to lead the nation on.
So let me go to Tony again and just take up the second question, which is, how are we thinking about the future of work and its transformational change on our students and our families? We know that many jobs are requiring post-high school education and training, degrees and certificates, but what does this mean for workers, and especially for students that are working their way through college as well as, into the workforce for upward mobility?
I think, as an old lobbyist for the AFL-CIO, I have to say that technology and its change, which is what's been driving us in labor markets and in education since the mid-'80s, it's better for all of us. I think that's pretty clear, but it's really bad for some of us. And the real political question we've never resolved, and it's been since the 80s and before, is what will all of us who win do for some of us who lose? And the answer is not much, at least so far. And we're paying for it in our politics. So I think for instance, the top 5 European OECD nations in what's called active labor market policy spend 4% or beneath that of their GDP on those kinds of policies, training, counseling, et cetera. We spend less than 0.3% of our GDP on those kinds of programs. I think, and conservatives are actually coming around to this. They're saying we need to do this to save capitalism, which is new for me in conversations with conservative economists. The other thing I want to say is to tell people not to worry too much. The bottom line is that in the short term, technology change will harm some of us and eliminate our jobs. Over the next 10 years, maybe 8 to 12% of jobs. But we will, in the end, create many more job openings than the jobs that are eliminated. And in the short term, say over a decade, what technology does is it rarely eliminates jobs and creates new ones of any significance. What it does is it changes the tasks and activities in jobs so that the knowledge, skills, abilities, work values, work interests, personality traits that are implicit in different occupations, they change over time. That's a question of adapting, not so much of sort of giving up on our education system. Over a 10-year period, the labor market doesn't, notwithstanding recessions, it doesn't change that much. We know it grows. So I think with the notable exception of, and there is a notable exception here throughout, and that is infrastructure. We're about to see a bump in the curve in American job performance. And that is that we're going to have a lot of jobs suddenly after years of decline in high school, jobs that only required high school, we're going to get an increase. And those infrastructure jobs that will build and install new technology, basically, if you think of bridges as technology, and I do, in the end, those jobs, there'll be a lot of them for a while, maybe 8 years, 9 years, but it'll take a lot fewer people with high school degrees to maintain that technology than it will to build that technology. So in the end, we've got you don't turn away that many jobs over a 10-year period. I'm not blaming anybody for voting for infrastructure. It's a good thing. But in the end, there is an issue coming there. We're about to reproduce in small sectors of the economy, not huge. We're about to reproduce the problem we had with deindustrialization. Only it's going to be in infrastructure. So having said that, I think it's pretty clear, notwithstanding the pandemic, that the big numbers don't change. We think in our preliminary estimates that by 2031, 70% of jobs will require at least some education and training beyond high school. We think that maybe 15% will be master's degrees or higher, 25% bachelor's degrees, less than 20% associate degrees or some college certificates, for instance. Among the remaining 30%, which are high school or less, about 24% will require high school, and we end up with 6% require that will go to people without any high school degree. But the more important point here is where the good jobs will be. And for us, we arrived with a bunch of economists at a definition of a good job a few years ago, which is basically it'll pay you 35 grand at a minimum in your early working years, understanding that it's going to take a lot longer to get to that first good job than it used to. Basically, the ages moved from 25 to 30 for people to get from dependency to some measure of independence now. And that overall, the median for these jobs is about 65K at a minimum when you track them out far enough. So in the end, the good jobs held by people with bachelor's degrees will be dominant. Middle skills jobs, a good 23% of those will be good jobs. But the dominant good job producer going forward is still the BA.
So Alexandria, what do you think about all this? What do you think about the good jobs and, whether degrees and certificates are going to matter, and what does it mean for the workforce and the upcoming people coming into the workforce that want those jobs?
Yeah. Well, I think it's absolutely clear. We know that individuals with post-secondary education, and particularly, as Tony points out, a bachelor's degree, are less likely to experience unemployment and are more likely to be able to obtain those good jobs that let them, provide for their family. And in the long run, infrastructure notwithstanding, that's particularly likely to be true. So what does this really mean for workers? This was brought up earlier by Mitchell and Tony. This means all the more that we really need to improve the way post-secondary education is set up. It needs to be set up in ways for workers and adults to get that post-secondary training when they don't have it. And if they do have some post-secondary training, but not yet that bachelor's degree that's going to make it more likely for them to have that good job, things need to be set up in a way that accommodates that. And I think we all need to take a step back. It's kind of a thought exercise. If your objective was to help existing adult workers get post-secondary education, how would you set post-secondary education up? When would you schedule classes? What supports would you provide in terms of childcare, et cetera? How long would a term be? All that needs to be considered. We've got to really shake ourselves out of our traditional models and look at the realities faced by today's students and think about what we can do to improve our systems to foster their success. There are definitely innovations occurring. There are programs that are considering workers' needs, but not yet at the scale we need by any stretch. Just an illustration of that, out of those hundreds of free college and promise programs that we studied, most of which, as I said, were focused on recent high school grads, some of which were kind of agnostic about the age or life experience that participants could have in order to enroll. Only 4 programs were focused exclusively on adults. We've got to do more to serve adults if we're going to make a real difference in folks' lives and improve our post-secondary attainment as a nation.
Thanks for that. Mitch, what are your comments on this? What about the transformational aspects of the workforce and, the necessity of higher education as far as you can go? What does it mean for workers in the future? think you're on mute.
Tony mentioned that we never resolved, who's responsible for those on the losing end of economic change. I would suggest that there's another ambiguity in American political culture, and it's this question: who is responsible for my lifelong employment? Right? Who is responsible for me being able to be employed in ways that adequately maintain myself and my household over the life course? I refer to the answer to that question as the United States of you're on your own at present. By virtue of a series of historical contingencies, Americans came to an agreement by the first third of the 20th century that everyone who lived in the United States was owed a high school diploma or the ability to get one. And by the second third of the 20th century, there was a general agreement that if someone failed to obtain a high school diploma, it was the system that had failed the learner and not the learner that had failed the system. But the moment one finishes high school, the question of responsibility becomes highly ambiguous, right? Post-secondary education is not a right. It's only partially an entitlement. I would argue that the loan system that Americans created in the 1970s for financing higher education embodies a presumption that my education is in fact my responsibility, that it's my job to invest in myself to accrete my own human capital. And that may have made some sense in the policy landscape of the early 1970s, but I think it's become a nearly disastrous situation at present because of the ambiguity of responsibility here. And so that's why I feel like adding years of college to the social contract is frankly not an ideal way of re-narrating that contract. I want an answer, what am I owed as an American citizen, resident, or worker over the course of my entire life, whether or not I have a college diploma, right? And I can imagine an American settlement in which that responsibility is partly mine, but it's also partly my employer's. It's also partly the state where I live. It's also partly the federal government's, right? And I think we need to, as we, social scientists, again, we tend to technicize problems and solutions, but I think we also need to think about what the narrative of opportunity is that we can develop with a broad plurality of Americans that make people feel like there are people and organizations that they can turn to again and again and again in the course of their lives as the demands of the economy and the society that we live in change. I think that the European democracies give us some models of that. I think China gives us an interesting model of that. I don't agree with these models necessarily, but I do think we need to revisit the social contract that Americans negotiated between the state and higher education in the middle of the 20th century, and think about what new models of reciprocal obligation we want to develop for the next generation.
Well, thanks for that insight. I'm going to go to the final question and then ask you to give some final thoughts. But we have some data that first generation students who are graduating and getting into the workforce are taking jobs in which they are underemployed. And that makes upward mobility much more difficult. What insights and suggestions can you share on this problem? Tony, why don't we start with you again?
Well, it is true. That is, we know that not only do minorities, low-income, working-class students don't have access to education, and beyond that, they don't have access to work-based learning anymore. The youth labor market basically collapsed along with the industrial labor market, and increasingly, one of the requirements for getting a good job by age 30, let's say, whereas it used to be more like age 25 if you came into the labor market in the 70s. one of the requirements now is work experience, and work experience of a certain quality. We don't really know what to do with that. There's a run on internships. You can't, if you want to go to a selective college and you take the tour, if they don't tell you about the internships, your parents aren't going to want you to go there. So there is a wide distribution now. That is the usual distribution by race and class of access to work-based learning, and that's a new problem. Also, there's an efficiency gain in education, which is a good thing. I mean, it's hard for me as an economist to argue against efficiency gains, but we've done a lot of things, beginning with AP, IB, dual enrollment, early college, gifted programs, and so on, so that the walls have come down for advantaged students moving through the system, all the way through that new phase in the life cycle, which is basically 18 to 30 now.
That's right.
Where you need work experience, you need education, you need counseling to figure out where the hell you are and where to go next. And we really don't do much about it. I think the social contract needs to consider the fact that there is a new stage in the life cycle that's largely human capital related, that we need to provide for, and that's what the whole free college movement is about. It's a keystone in that infrastructure, but there's more necessary there.
And so, Alexandria, what do you think about the underemployment of people coming up and the upward mobility challenges?
Yeah, I think there's really three things that we need to do, and Tony alluded to a lot of this. So first, we need to address those information barriers so that students can make informed decisions about their post-secondary education specifically. And when I say post-secondary education, in that I include the credential to pursue, a certificate, associate's, bachelor's degree, having information about the pros and cons and what those are likely to lead to. Then as part of that also, knowing about the fields of study, knowing what earnings you might expect with a petroleum engineering major versus an early childhood education major, to use a common contrast. And then thirdly, where to study, the institution. We know that different institutions have different graduation rates and have different labor market outcomes for their students. So first and foremost, students need to have more information about that so that regardless of background, folks are able to make better decisions about that. But then there's this whole second piece, and I feel like this is even weaker in terms of a need for the field. What we're providing is weaker in that we really need to address information barriers around career options. So I'd argue that for most students need better information, but that's particularly true for students whose family and social network doesn't have post-secondary experience that can connect them to people who do have post-secondary experience to talk about the career options that are available. And then they're beyond the information piece to really help with that transition to career. We need to provide more equitable opportunities. And as Tony says, there's been some improvements for students to successfully prepare for those career options. We need to, most importantly, create stronger and more equitable work-based learning opportunities through internships, through apprenticeships, through co-ops. And those work-based learning opportunities, those can actually do double duty. They can help address both the information barrier about career options and address experience barriers. So students who participate in work-based learning can get those employability skills that are critical to succeeding in the workplace, and also the social capital or connections that really help in securing positions. But there's still a lot more to be done to make work-based learning opportunities expansive enough and equitable.
And I would add, paid for.
Yes,
because
that's part of the equity piece, for sure.
The majority of students are working hard as well in the workforce. Mitch, any thoughts about the underemployment, students taking jobs that they have they're overqualified for, so they're underemployed, and what about their upward mobility?
2 points. One brass tacks, kind of frowny face, and one pie in the sky, smiley face. The first one echoes Alexandria's point about transparency. As a sector, we have to figure out how we're going to get there. because and we know a big part of the impediment are the elite schools that have systematically, categorically, over and over and over and over again resisted the kind of transparency that educators seem to presume, that colleges and universities at the other end of the status spectrum, should be delivering. And so I really want us as a sector to think about, how we can use the levers of, frankly, federal funding to get colleges and universities to figure out the non-rocket science question of how we are going to build an infrastructure for observing progress, pathways, and returns through post-secondary education. It's not a technical problem. It's a political problem, and it's a political problem that, frankly, colleges and universities promulgate on their own. And so I really hope, again, we use the hiatus that the reconciliation brought our sector to sort of figure out how we're going to get from fake transparency to real transparency. And the second is again the more smiley face. I live in Silicon Valley, so there always has to be a happy ending. My colleague Laura Karstensen heads the Center on Longevity here, and she talks about what the new map of life, right? As life courses lengthen for everybody, especially for the more socioeconomically privileged, but as they lengthen for everybody, she raises the audacious question of, where do we put those extra years? Currently, we've tacked them on to the end of the life course, and we've made being elderly and retired a longer period of time. But what if we moved those back earlier into the life course, into the period that Tony mentioned, right? And what if we centered the new social contract on the third decade of life, right? What are young Americans who are at their peak in many ways? What are they owed? How could we best take advantage of the intellect and energy and vitality of that period of life? And maybe we could finally, figure out a way to sort of complicate the pathways to adulthood that have systematically made people who don't go to college feel like they're second or third class citizens. And I think that's an enormous opportunity. And again, a creative, generative opportunity that we can use the next couple of years to see if we can take advantage of that, of those wonderful years of life that end up not working out so well for some of our less advantaged Americans.
Well, this is bringing us to close out our session. And what I want to do is just give you each a minute to give us a reflection or one piece of advice going forward. So, Tony, why don't we start with you, and then Alexandria and Mitch, and then I'll wrap.
I think that we're headed in the right direction in political time, policy time, legislative time. It actually, I think, has been relatively fast. You and I, Martha, have been around that for a while. I remember 13 years ago when people started talking about earnings returns at the program level using employer wage record data. That was a very radical idea. It no longer is at all. So that if anything, that system we have the data, we just don't have the career navigation and other navigation tools to actually allow people to benefit from it, or allow the system itself to benefit from it so that it can adapt to people's needs. So I think we're getting there. I think the momentum is unstoppable. There are some pieces here that are really just about money. And that is not only access to education, but access to supportive services, career counseling, mental health services. The list continues to grow. And when you add all that up, as they sort of did for one set of things and Build Back Better, it knocks your socks off. So the question, I think, is the momentum is there on both sides of the aisle. That is, Republicans don't favor education so much because they think it creates Democrats, which it does. But they do favor training, and they do favor the employer needs in this economic system. And it's not surprising that in a capitalist economy, we're now demanding that educators make people employable, as well as allowing them to live more fully in their time and all that. So I think we're headed there. It's just going to take a long time.
What do you think, Alexandria?
Yeah, so what I would take away from this session is really that, as we've talked about, the economy is changing. It's speeding up with technology, and that's creating a need for post-secondary opportunities along the way and along the life course, as we've talked about. And so we need to make sure, and what I would suggest to everyone listening is to really make sure our post-secondary institutions and the programs we set up, like free college programs, are placing the attention that's needed on adults. Right now, from where I sit, there's far too, you can never say too much attention on recent high school graduates, but adults cannot be left out of the discussion and left out of the shuffle if we really want to provide opportunity to Americans and allow them to get the post-secondary credentials that they need to have a good job.
Just one thing that I learned the hard way working for politicians about that, and that is way back in the day, CETA, for those of you who remember that. When I was on the Hill and was part of putting that bill together, and the senators who were part of putting that bill together, and I went with them and on various occasions out to their states, and they held meetings, and they waxed poetic and about this new Comprehensive Employment Training Act, which was going to get them training and new jobs. And I remember being with Ed Muskie, who was a senator from Maine, and he and I going to a particular plant, and he did his thing, and then I did my staff thing about the bill. And then there was no applause. It was very tepid. And as we were walking out the door, he said to me, "We just told them all they're fired." And he never brought this stuff up again. Bill Clinton learned the same thing.
Yes, he did.
And then focused on higher education for young people. Everybody since then has learned you don't talk about education and training to adults. You talk about jobs, whether you can deliver them or not. So there is a problem here with adults. That is, they don't want to be trained in it. I don't want anybody to send me back to school. So, there is this is a difficulty. This is good government. It's not good politics.
And Mitch, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and riffing on both of those things, I would say, let's use the short-term loss of free college as an opportunity for all of us, but perhaps especially your organization. What is this college promise? What in fact does it entail, right? And maybe we should suspend the presumption that we know the answer to that question, or that the answers to that question that you guys created over the last 5 years is necessarily the recipe, right? That we want to do when we try again, which we will, right? And recognizing the lessons of history that Tony just said, right? How do we create a narrative of promise, right? That makes people feel like they're getting something valuable that they didn't previously have. And on my view, that's probably part of the reason we're still facing this problem, is we haven't figured out a narrative that squares that circle. That's a good challenge for the men and women who populate this movement and organization and make it go.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you, Tony, Alexandria, and Mitch, for coming and joining us today. It was really exciting to hear your expertise, your advice on the future of free college and how it maps to workforce opportunities in the labor market and society as a whole. And all of us will keep moving forward. To the audience, thank you again for joining us for this panel and for the College Promise Careers Institute. I'd like you to stay tuned for our other sessions, as we have a very robust program of panels to come. Thanks so much. Onward.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.